Greetings and welcome to a stateless dialogue, those affected and those in power. Statelessness affects over 15 million people globally, but remains to be largely unknown, underreported, and misunderstood. Traditionally, the field of statelessness has evolved in a top-down manner, where the expertise is centered around NGOs, academics, the UN, over those with lived experiences and knowledge of the affected persons and advocates. NGOs have better access to funding. Academics speak in global forums, which are inaccessible to stateless advocates and local actors. UN collaborates with governments that deny statelessness, while the diplomatic world is constricted by geopolitics and maintenance of state relationships. During this session, we will explore and discuss the asymmetric power within the stateless field, a global human rights abuse. You will hear from 6 panelists, 3 of which are stateless activists, who will engage in dialogue with 3 representatives from the United Nations, donor, and diplomatic worlds. Before we begin, we would like to ask you a question. Through the poll extension on Zoom, we will ask you, do you know what stateless is? With a multiple choice option of yes, no, a little bit. I'll give you some time. Okay, and the results are in. We have about 71% of you know what statelessness is, and 29% of you have a little bit of knowledge. Well, there's no one here that does not know what it is. That's great. I'll stop sharing at the moment. Before we begin, we would like to share with you a short video audio clip that will largely focus as a reminder and a refresher on this issue. Launch video clip.
So there's a legal definition of statelessness. It goes like this. A stateless person is an individual who is not recognized by any country as a national under the operation of its law. And this is then a person who does not have any nationality of any country across the world. So how do people become stateless?
Some people are stateless because of historical circumstances. So in African countries, for example, as a result of colonialism, some people are in this liminal state of not having the citizenship of the state that they're in because borders changed. And so you have different circumstances that create stateless populations. In other contexts, a child is born, that child isn't able to get a birth certificate, and maybe it's because of their religion or their ethnicity or their religious belonging of their parents, and then they end up stateless as well. And so there's countless different examples of how people become stateless, but often discrimination plays a role.
So there are many reasons that people can become stateless, and it is clear that the impact is devastating. The UN says that there are around 10 million stateless people in the world, but this is very much an estimate. The real figure is much higher. By its very nature, being stateless means that people have little or no official documentation. It's most likely that they've never been registered anywhere, so getting any kind of statistics on this population is near impossible. Most importantly, their right to have rights is often denied. And in a world where being able to legally identify yourself is vital, the stateless find themselves invisible. They exist in a sort of limbo world, struggling with a day-to-day existence, in which they have to prove their right to belong at every turn. What's at stake in situations of statelessness is the enjoyment of the right to a nationality. And so, of course, being stateless is being denied this. But how do most people get nationality in the first place? Professor René de Roodt explains.
Yeah, there are several ways to get a nationality, but most people get a nationality in the moment of birth, and that can have two reasons. One can get a nationality due to the fact that one of the parents has the nationality of the country involved. For example, I got the nationality of the Netherlands because my father was a Netherlands national. Another possibility is that you get the nationality by birth on the territory of a state. That happens, for example, in the United States. My sister was living in the United States, and she got children on the territory of the United States, and then the children were automatically American citizens. And a third way to get a nationality is by so-called naturalization. That is, getting the nationality on application. For example, one came as a migrant in a country and having resided there for a certain period. Normally, states used to require between 3 and 10 years. It depends on the country. Then you can apply for citizenship, and if you meet all the conditions, you will be granted the nationality by, as we call it, naturalization.
Let us begin. My name is Karina Ambartumian Clow. I am a stateless person, and I have been stateless since childhood. I am based in the United States. I'm also a founding member and executive director of United Stateless. I would like to introduce my co-panelist in this first session, Joanne Kelsey, who is the Associate Protection Officer at United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, or UNHCR, in the United States Regional Office. Joanne?
Hey, everybody. Thank you for having us today. And Karina, it's a pleasure to be here chatting with you. Just to give a little clarity, a lot of folks know that UNHCR has the mandate to protect refugees and asylum seekers around the world. But we also have the mandate to work to reduce and prevent statelessness around the world. And that is what brings me here today, because I'm the focal point on statelessness in Washington, D.C., in the D.C. office. I think it would be kind of great for everyone if we could just start. Karina, if you could talk for a second, or as long as you want, about what statelessness means to you.
Yeah. Statelessness means to me that I have been very used to disappointments, rejections, and limitations based on circumstances that are completely out of my control. Mm-hmm. Specifically, not having a nationality, which means that I do not have direct access to identification. I'm unable to retain travel documentation. And those two things have led to just unable to move mobily. Access to healthcare, education, everyday occurrences where you're asked for your ID, have become inability to participate in society at times. Mm-hmm. It means that if this conference was in person without any virtual options, I would not have been able to participate on this panel. Recently, I've learned this phrase, ambiguous loss, which means a loss that cures without closure. And I think globally, we've felt that through the pandemic. And as a stateless person and reflective of my community of other stateless people, we have had those experiences profound, ranging from, not being able to enjoy a glass of wine with your friends at a bar because you know that they check identification at the door, to experiencing a 30-year separation from your parents and losing the chance for unification due to their passing. Being stateless means that I'm very aware of the reality that I may live in this status for the rest of my life, unless powers beyond my control implement policies and legislation that give people like me protection, inclusion, and participation. Understanding that, now let's ask you a question. Understanding that you have worked on and off over the years for UNHCR on the issue of statelessness, how has your work or work context changed?
Yeah, so when I first started working on the issue of statelessness 10 or 15 years ago with UNHCR, it was pretty theoretical. We would get a note or an email or a letter, because it was 10 or 15 years ago and that was more common, from someone who would write to us and say, I'm stateless, I live in the United States, you're UNHCR, like, what can you do for me? And we had this little paragraph, standard response, and we would just send that back, case closed, move on. And then at some point, and honestly, Karina, I don't remember why, I think a colleague just said to me, like, most of your work is boring. You should dig in on this statelessness, understand that better. I don't understand it. So I started to dig in and try to understand it. And I reached out to a woman named Tatiana, who you now know well because she's a founding member of United Stateless. And we started to talk, and I moved from seeing statelessness as an intellectual exercise, something on paper, to a set of individuals who really are so hampered by this loss of a human right, the right to, to their nationality. And I got to start working with a bunch of stateless folks, of course, you included, and really dig in to figure out how to solve this situation. And I think because of my experience also, I was really fortunate. And I don't know how much you and I have talked about this, but I've always been able to see very clearly what the solution is in the United States. And so it's been easy to keep pushing things forward. So what about you? How does your understanding of statelessness in your work, how has that changed over the years, and your work with like how it intersects with UNHCR?
Yeah, honestly, if 4 years ago you asked me this question, I would have responded very differently. At the time, I was in my late 20s. I was waiting tables, taking a break from nonprofit community organizing work, oddly enough.
Mm-hmm.
And I came to the U.S. at 8 years old, from a country that didn't exist anymore. And I was placed on a final order of removal at 13. And I finally come to learn that my immigration problem had a name. I am stateless. And, with the release of the Citizens of Norway report that UNHCR, put together in 2012, and knowing that statelessness was included in the Refugee Protection Act, I assumed that high-level organizations were actively advocating on people like me in the US, and that the Refugee Protection Act or some kind of legislation would pass them within my lifetime. I also never knew another stateless person. I really thought I was like the only one. And I was very wrong. I know now that stateless people, we must be our own champions. And we are uniquely qualified to do so. And we must be in the room to have these conversations towards a solution. Our training is a little bit different. We don't have a legal background along with a policy background, along with maybe another PhD somewhere. We have this lived experiences, and we must work together. It fits perfectly to have the solutions dictated by those that are impacted by it, because unfortunately, this isn't just a job for us. This is our lives.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit more about what changed, or how your thinking has changed?
Yeah, sure, of course. I think in some ways it's not, my thinking changed along the way, I think I've mentioned, but what coming in and out of the UNHCR office, what I've seen is the office move from my initial and my predecessors look at this as, like I said, an intellectual exercise, right? To seeing impacted stateless people as people, not just a part of an intellectual exercise. And then I think that UNHCR went through a period of viewing their work on statelessness as very paternalistic, I think I would call it, or almost victim, like almost approaching stateless people as victims, as opposed to an empowerment approach, which is I like to believe where we are now. And you mentioned the Refugee Protection Act and the stateless provisions within that. And for other folks listening, this is it was legislation that was introduced but never passed by the U.S. Congress, right? Which is the solution for stateless people in the U.S. We need Congress to pass legislation. But with the first time it was ever written, it was me and a colleague locked in a room, and then we never asked anyone who was stateless what they thought of it. We were like, well, it's a solution, they should be happy, and we just passed it up. But this year it was pretty exciting. We sat together, legal experts, stateless individuals, and UNHCR. We all sat around sort of like a virtual roundtable. And every Friday for like hours, we would hammer out how we thought we could resolve this legislatively. And the resulting draft legislation looks incredibly different than the first pass that we ever had at it, because we had stateless people saying, well, okay, but would it fix this situation? Like you didn't, guys didn't need to be legal experts. You explained your lived experiences and those people that you'd met, and made sure that we covered everybody. So what did you think of that? What was your experience during that?
I thought it was amazing. I thought it was really cool that we, as an organization, we inherited some of these, we inherited an advocacy platform handed down to us before, you and various other different individuals. And I don't think I realized at the time how special those long Zoom calls were to discuss law, because it gave me an important gift to learn how to tell my story from a legal perspective. And that is something so incredibly healing for me, someone that has had that has the emotional and trauma experience out of it, to be able to tell my story differently from a third person's perspective. And I can talk about it without getting emotional, which I'm fine with a good cry. But sometimes I don't want to reveal too much of myself in a public space or in meetings with, quite honestly, strangers with high level positions.
Yeah. So, Karina, obviously you and I, have a pretty strong relationship and are trying, I think, work well in partnership. But what can UNHCR do to better support you?
Put more funding and resources in the UNHCR stateless mandate across all regions, especially in Geneva. And while I'm at it, let's clone you at the US office.
I was going to say, from your lips to Felipe Grande's ears.
Hire stateless people, to work within the UNHCR. I think, stateless people need to be at the table from all perspectives and all angles of this issue. Educate staff internally across all UN agencies on this issue. Collaborate with us, include us, work side by side with us. And just hitting on something you said, transition, and might be some kind of training. It might be some kind of, roundtable of changing perspectives of viewing stateless people as victims and transitioning that perspective into viewing us as empowerment speakers towards our solution, at chances at a different ending to our stories. Is there anything you'd like to add before we close and transition to the next group?
Yeah, no, I kind of wish we could talk. Well, let's take this offline, because I know we didn't fully script this, but I will say that one thought I've had is that I've seen that activists like you and like Maha, whose last name I can't quite remember, UNHCR, we do tend to grab onto you, and then you're the people that we reach out to. I think we need to get UNHCR to look around the world and start to identify, be active in identifying people who are emerging leaders and not wait for them to emerge themselves. So I will leave it at that. But thanks so much, Karina.
Sorry about that. Thank you. Thank you, Joanne, for joining me in the first discussion. I would like to then transition to the next speakers. I'd like to introduce Beena Ramanand, Lead Coordinator for Family Frontiers, in conversation with Tracy Gerd, Senior Director of Civil and Political Rights and Advocacy at American Jewish World Service, or AJWS. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Karina. It was great to listen to you and Joanne. And good evening, Beena. Nice to see
Hello,
you.
Tracy.
Hi.
Hi.
I wonder if we can start off. I'd love to hear from you the same question that Joanne asked Karina. Can you tell me a little bit about what statelessness means to you?
Yeah, so I'm going to discuss some of the issues that face stateless people in Malaysia. And gender discrimination in nationality laws is one of the root causes of childhood statelessness. And gender discriminatory policies and practices also contribute largely towards statelessness. Malaysia is one of 25 countries that does not allow overseas born children of Malaysian women to acquire Malaysian citizenship on an equal basis as children of Malaysian men. We are in the year 2020. Women should have equality. And Malaysia is also one of 3 countries that does not allow children of Malaysian fathers citizenship when born prior to marriage with a foreign mother. Other categories of children who have difficulty accessing Malaysian citizenship are adopted children, foundlings whose parents have abandoned them, children brought up in state welfare homes, and migrant and refugee children whose both parents are non-Malaysians. Many of these children who are denied Malaysian citizenship under these provisions are stateless. And in the state of Sabah and Sarawak, there's intergenerational statelessness, which is a deep-rooted problem. And so you have heard from Karina, the impact on these children who are without a legal identity. They have difficulty accessing fundamental rights and opportunities afforded to normal citizens of the country, and they are also deprived of the right to education, access to mandatory vaccinations. I mean, this should be non-negotiable. For every child should be able to get mandatory vaccinations, access to healthcare, economic rights. When they become adults, they are denied mobility as well. So young people are often denied, and we've seen it. It has a tremendous impact when they are unable to receive tertiary education or find decent employment. They face discrimination and harassment and are vulnerable to even human trafficking, exploitation by employers. And bear in mind, there are provisions that are contained in the Malaysian citizenship laws. And if it is fully applied, it could help to resolve the legal status of many of these individuals. But this is not being utilized in Malaysia. Tracy, so then how is statelessness, let me ask you this question, how is statelessness significant to your work? And what barriers do you encounter working on it?
Thank you, Beena. It was really interesting listening to your work, and thank you for that overview. And I think for us at American Jewish World Service, we're a grant making and an advocacy organization. We work on statelessness issues for a lot of the reasons that you talk about. So I run a civil and political rights grant making program, and within that we work on statelessness in 2 main areas. One is with the Rohingya community in Burma, and also one with Dominicans of Haitian descent in the Dominican Republic. And, just speaking to what you were saying, I think it was important to us because in both of these countries, laws, judgments, regulations, they stripped many within these communities of citizenship. And consequently, it diminished or eradicated their ability to access so many of the rights that are really core to belonging to a place, to a country, you know, whether it's education or movement or healthcare or jobs. And it rendered these communities just so vulnerable to discrimination, to violence, to deportation, and in the case of the Rohingya, a genocide by their own government. So for us, it was really, you know, core to our thinking about human rights to be able to work on statelessness issues. In terms of your question about barriers, I will say, I think part of the challenges generally for funders working on in the rights or democracy or other areas is really this unfortunate sense that statelessness is a niche issue, that somehow it's outside of or unrelated to, you know, their thematic or their geographic priorities that funders have, rather than seeing it kind of as you have talked about and as Karina talked about, is really a prerequisite to accessing a whole range of other rights that people should be able to access in terms of their protection. So I think this also represents, you know, a big opportunity for statelessness advocates as well to kind of build this knowledge and connect the dots for funders. But I do know that that's just one of the reasons why funders are difficult for stateless people. But I wonder if I could ask you, what could the donor world do better to support stateless advocacy and advocates?
Thank you, Tracy, for that. For young organizations, the Family Frontiers, we are a self-led organization, self-led by impacted persons, and we work with grassroots communities towards law reform and policy change. And although our work is very visible right now, it's hard to attract donors. A lot of our times is spent writing funding proposals, submitting complicated budgets as the requirement of funders, and only to find ourselves being rejected. And we do get some short-term funding, but due to the time you spend writing a proposal and have the burdensome reporting, it leaves us with not enough time to spend on actual advocacy and community work that we really want to be involved in. So, grassroots organizations led by impacted persons would really appreciate receiving multi-year co-funding that would free us from this, and allow us to continue doing our work. And as you said, Tracy, statelessness is often seen as a non-citizen issue, but it is such important work that would be life-changing for every person who has been given a legal identity.
Yes.
And really, we would wish that funders would be more open to funding such important issues that has a tremendous impact on the lives of people. And organizations like ours would also appreciate getting a little flexible funding. And I'm not talking about us not being accountable. Definitely, accountability is something, we would advocate for. But like, to give you an example, we got the COVID Emergency Stateless Fund. And at the time when there was, during the pandemic, and there was a movement control order, which we had not expected, and we could not meet physically. So what actually happened was we got flexibility to move to online stakeholder and to an online meetings and community-based meetings, which were held online rather than having physical meetings. So the other thing that we really appreciated from our donor, and let me tell you, that was Institute of Statelessness and Inclusion. they really were available when we had emergencies. They gave us guidance, and as funding recipients, we often discuss our projects with other activists. There are meetings, formal meetings that are set up where we can actually discuss where we are with our projects, what outcomes we've had, what are best practices. And it's been a totally enriching and also motivating exercise, because in this kind of work, we are quite on our own, and often working, where there's very little success sometimes. So, it really motivates us to hear other organizations are having successes with some of the activities they have done, and we can also model our advocacy based on that. So it's been good to know that, that the funder is involved in our activities, is there to offer guidance and support. And that has been really very helpful as well, Tracy. Thank you. And now let me ask you, it's my turn to ask you, how can the donor community do better in responding and also having good practices?
Thank you, Bina. And you hit on so many important points, I think, and I just want to reaffirm the points that you were making here. I think there's really three key areas I wanted to bring up. One is about the importance of just educating ourselves as funders. I've been really, really lucky that I have people who can mentor me, like Karina. I've called on her to help me understand certain issues, and I've been so lucky. But not everybody has their ability to talk individually to people like Karina. But ISI also offers some great educational resources for people who want to educate themselves. So that's one place to start for donors, I think. Your point, Bina, about the processes of funders is really, really important. It can be so burdensome and onerous for people to try and access funding. And I think really my thinking is about how important it is for funders to streamline their processes, make it easier in terms of applying and reporting, lighten those loads. I think perhaps also to try and address the point you're talking about, Bina, is there a way that funders can actually talk to groups a little bit beforehand, before asking them to jump through all these hoops of very burdensome proposals? I think another area is trying to think about the access gaps. And this is really important, particularly where there are marginalized communities. Often the people who get the funding within those communities are highly educated, they're English speakers, they might be from the diaspora. And I think making more effort as funders to try and reach other groups. And we're trying to do this. This is still a difficult area for us. It's a work in progress for us, but I think it's a really important one. And I think this issue of trying to include stateless people in the decision making as well, that Karina was talking about, I think that's really key. I think ISI has done a really great job of that in terms of their COVID fund, for example, of making it very participatory. We're not there yet as a funder, unfortunately, but I hope that that's increasingly a way that we move towards in the future. And then just finally, I know we're running out of time and I want to hear the other speakers, but I think your point too, Bina, about the type of funding is so important. This flexible multi-year core funding is so crucial. And I think COVID has actually shown us how important that is. We tried to switch straight away, not just in our statelessness work, but more generally to giving general support grants to our grantees when COVID hit. And we saw just how creative people could be when they're given flexible funding, when they're given core support, either just to keep the lights on or to pivot for unexpected things. The multi-year one is really important to give people security. We're trying to get there. We're also a fundraising organization ourselves, so each year, so it's very hard for us to also commit to longer term funding, but we're trying to find ways to get there. So I think there's some key things for funders to think about. But it's been so great speaking to you, Bina. I think it's time for us to hand over to our other panelists.
And thank you, Tracy. This has been really an insightful conversation, which we should carry on outside this meeting. Yes, so that we can understand better what donors require from us grantees, and help you to understand better our issues. So thank you so much. This has been such a great conversation, which I'm sure Tracy and myself are going to continue outside this platform. Now, let me introduce you to two very important people. We have Ne San Win. He's an activist and co-founder of the Free Rohingya Coalition. And he's going to be in conversation with Letitia Van Den Asum, who's a diplomatic expert. So over to both of you. Just take it from here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So, hello everyone. Thank you so much for giving me an opportunity to participate here today with my co-panelist, Letitia. And I'm Nesanwe, being an activist of the Rohingya community from Myanmar, that we talk about the Rohingya people here. The Rohingya is mostly known as stateless minority, live in Rakhine State, Myanmar. And the majority of the Rohingya are now in Bangladesh, a Bangladeshi refugee camp since 2017, as a result of a genocidal campaign launched by the Myanmar Authority over the past 40 years. So the statelessness meant to me that if I were in Myanmar today, I will not have the chance to participate here. And in Myanmar, I will not be allowed to identify myself as a Rohingya activist. And basically, I will not have any document that will able to travel just 2-3 minute walking distance, particularly from one village to another. Basically, I will not have any. I will be an individual without any basic human right if I were in Myanmar today. Thanks to the God, I am here in Europe today. I have the chance to speak, and I will speak a few things about the people in Myanmar and Bangladesh. They are suffering. So we Rohingya were not stateless. We were we were made stateless by the state that we belong to. 70 years ago, when Myanmar Burmese authority handed citizenship across the country, we were the first group to obtain the full citizenship. Our ethnic identity was officially recognized. I mean, our existence was officially recognized by the Burmese authority. But as a matter of policy, to wipe off the entire Rohingya population from Rakhine State, our citizenship documents were taken away in the mid-1970s. And in 1982, the government entered the new citizenship law that made us stateless within our own country. This law was entered by the military regime. As of now, 75% of our population are taking shelter as refugee in Bangladesh, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, India, Malaysia, Europe, North America, and in many other countries. So, as I mentioned earlier, in our country, we do not exist. We are not allowed to identify ourselves. And we are called illegal immigrant from Bangladesh, intruder, interloper, by the Myanmar government and the public. So we don't have any right like freedom of movement, education, opportunity for livelihood. All basic human rights have been denied for more than 40 years. And our daily life is like a prisoner in the country now. Almost about 600,000 Rohingya remaining inside the country. 150,000 are confined into the camp. So my co-panelist and the diplomatic expert, Letitia, has visited all those camps, and also the area, those, that the people are confined into their village for more than 3 decades. All those area she has visited as a member of the Rakhine Commission, led by the late United Nations Secretary General Kofi Annan. So let me ask my co-panelists a question. So, Madam Letitia, how is statelessness significant to your work and barriers working on it? This is the first question. Second question will be followed.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Nissan, and for your question, but also for what you said, because it's a story that repeats, that deserves to be repeated over and over and over again. You and I have have been able to meet a number of times, and I particularly recall the Statelessness conference that was held in 2019 in The Hague, organized by the ISI.
Yeah. That
was the first ever of its kind, which really brought practitioners together with a lot of stateless people. But, before I answer your question, let me say one thing that I think is important for all of those in the international community who engage on the issue of statelessness. And that is, please make sure that before you engage others, you know about the statelessness in your own country. And the point is the importance of all of us working towards the recognition of statelessness as a key global issue and not as one that affects a more limited number of countries. Also, I think you gain credibility if you can make clear that you are speaking from the perspective of a shared problem. And that certainly applies to my own country, the Netherlands, where for many years the government really had to be pressured to put the necessary regulations in place to meet its basic obligations under international law. This affected a large number of people who were basically forced to live as what I prefer to call legal nobodies. It's been taking a major effort, and it continues to be a major effort here in the Netherlands. So it's better to speak from the feeling of shared experience. My own first encounter with a large group of people who were considered stateless by their own government was in the 1990s, when I was the Dutch ambassador to Myanmar. And this group was the very Rohingya that Nissan has spoken about so movingly. They are, as a matter of fact, the world's largest group of stateless people. And tragically, their situation has only deteriorated over the past couple of decades. And it's only, although their situation was known by the international community, it took until the shock of the 2017 effort by Myanmar's military to forcibly expel all of them across the border to Myanmar for it to get the attention it deserved. But there were others during my career. For example, to name one, the Nubians in Kenya, who are descendants of soldiers forcibly transferred from Sudan by the British colonial government. And I think that was now more than 100 years ago. And you find many of the similar situations that go back, 100 years or more, when colonial borders were set or reset. And I also encountered other stateless communities in places like Southern Africa, in Mexico, and in Thailand, which I think is the country that has a larger population of stateless people than any other. I think it's about 500,000. But, you know, in all of these countries, you had to look for stateless people. You had to reach out to them. For many of them, the threshold leading to diplomats and to UN staff was simply too high. Ultimately, I returned to Myanmar in 2016 to work on the situation in Rakhine State, as with Kofi Annan, as Nesan has mentioned. It was only then that I took a very close-up look at what it means to be a legal nobody. And not only a legal nobody, but to be forced to live under subhuman circumstances in a climate where you're othered. And with othered, I mean that it is made clear to you that you do not belong in your own homeland, that you are an enemy, and people are told that they should fear you. And there is no question that you can have the same basic rights as everyone else. And Nesan has already elaborated that, so I won't repeat that. But just one final point before I ask another question of Nesan. And that is that I've always found that it's important to show empathy and to be sensitive when you engage to the different perspectives of a specific stateless situation. To give you an example, and again, it's about the Rohingya, where the government and many actually in the international community consider the Rohingya as stateless people. But that is not how they view themselves. They see themselves as citizens who have been robbed of the citizenship that was theirs all along. And they have a point. It was taken away from them by an invalid stroke of the pen. Some Rohingya, and that's my final point, actually prefer to call themselves de facto stateless, as opposed to de jure stateless. And lo and behold, just a couple of years ago, to my total surprise, what happened? A small working group of people who call themselves experts were met in Geneva under the auspices of UNHCR and decided that it was better to no longer use the word de facto stateless. Nobody bothered to consult the Rohingya or any other people who find themselves in similar situations about that. So we really all have to be prepared to speak the language of those that we engage with and understand their perspectives. Now, Nesan, we're getting short of time already.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. You have highlighted
please,
a lot about our existence. So let me ask you the second question. The most important for us is to highlight our existence, that we belong to Myanmar. We are not the stateless, you know. That is the most important for us. So my second question is, as a diplomatic expert, how can your diplomatic community do better in responding and good practice?
Yeah, let me try to give you a couple of quick points. First of all, I think diplomats and others, UN staff and other people in the international community have to be aware of the current climate in the countries where you operate. Sadly, more often than not, it does not favor others. The fear of others is on the rise around the world. And it is becoming an ever greater problem around the world. And if you're like me, and you've been sent to various countries, and in the briefings that you received and the documentation you studied before you went to a new duty station, I never found anything about statelessness. And that says something about a country, in this case, the Netherlands, that says in its foreign policy that human rights is one of its key objectives. And but yet statelessness is somehow not on the radar. You may get some background on discrimination and xenophobia, and that is important, because these are pointers that can also be major impediments to reducing the number of people who are undocumented or stateless. Or stateless. So you have to be curious, you have to dig, you have to be prepared to study the legal and other barriers, and you have to reach out and keep asking questions. Lastly, ministries of foreign affairs, multilateral agents, and others have to make sure that the global issue of statelessness is recognized as a key concern for their work, not one that they do only whenever somebody bothers, whether it's parliamentarians or members of international organizations raise it. It has to be recognized as a key concern for everyone. So that has implications in terms of training. And perhaps, we should try to strive to make data on the statelessness in a given country widely available, much more widely available, and try to get it to be accepted as one of the key indicators to measure overall performance on human rights. And this is not only important for in-country work, it also applies to staff posted to multilateral institutions, because these are the places where global issues are discussed and decided. Think of migration, trafficking of persons, conflict and displacements, and so on. And all these issues are highly relevant to statelessness. And right now, and that's my final point, we really should make sure that those who debate climate issues, and that's the most discussed issue at the moment, are equipped to understand what the next couple of decades may mean in terms of rising statelessness. We have to be ahead of the wave, because rising statelessness, I'm afraid, should be anticipated. Thanks. But let me, if there's any time left, if we're allowed, to ask you what you think many of us in the international community should do better.
Sorry, you mean the international community and your community as well, right? The diplomatic community. For us, the diplomat are the representative of the head of the state or the government. So we all believe, most of the activists, they believe that non-violent struggle and also the peaceful dialogue are the solution to the crisis we are facing for decades. So the diplomats are very important, very powerful people for us, and they are like a bridge between the head of the state or the head of the government and us. So we have a lot of difficulty to reach to the head of the state, of the government official who are making the foreign policy. So we target the diplomat who can raise our voice to their government, who can convey our messages to their government. So because of this foreign policy are very important for us. So the diplomats are really very important for us to shape their policy toward those people who are persecuting us for decades. So with this opportunity, let me highlight a few things that will help to end our struggle and suffering. Most of the diplomats, they take seriously the press release and the propaganda made by the government. In Myanmar, we Rohingya are friendless, that and no one supported us, government, and the state media, private media, public, most of the civil society as well. They didn't support us until this year's coup. Of course, we have received solidarity from the many people after the coup. So what I would like to request to this diplomatic community, especially to those senior diplomats who are directly reporting to their government and the policy maker, just not to rely on the government report and the media report, especially for the Rohingya, because they are biased. They don't want us. They consider us an enemy, as you mentioned earlier. So my request is to engage with the grassroots activists, civil society, and the citizen journalists and the ordinary citizen. So we will have the direct access with the diplomat. We can raise our voice. Our voice will be heard by the all those, the making policy maker and the head of the government. So let me conclude here because we are running off the time. Thank you everyone for listening. And thank you, my co-panelists, Madam Leticia, for giving us your time with us. Thank you so much. So I think now Karina will, thank you.
Wow, this has been one of the most powerful panelist discussions I've ever witnessed and been able to be part of. I want to thank all my fellow panelists, Joanne Kelsey, Bina Ramanand, Tracy Gerd, Nai Se Lwin, and Leticia Vandesum. Thank you for taking the time to join me today. We featured an array of actors are involved in all different types of work around an issue that has not only happened, but continues to happen to this day. We've seen statelessness in atrocity crime. We've seen statelessness made possible through discrimination towards gender rights. We've seen statelessness through state dissolution, but we're going to continue to see this issue through climate change, through misinformation, through discrimination against minorities in different regime states. And I think the biggest message that we've seen today is sharing one of my favorite quotes is nothing about us without us is for us. In order to resolve statelessness and make it a relic of the past, I've seen a comment in the chat, to make statelessness, the stateless conventions practical, we need to have stateless voices involved. And as was mentioned, it looks different region to region, politics, state law, etc. But the most important part is involving stateless people directly. And because this issue unfortunately touches every single corner of the world, there are stateless people, stateless organizations in your country or region right now. Thank you. I also want to extend a thank you to Georgia Field of ISI and Ali Johar for being able to coordinate, organize all of us from all different types of time zones. And most importantly, I want to thank KPSRL. Thank you for hosting us and featuring it on your platform. With that, we have about 2-minute leeway. I feel like we can conclude here. Thank you.